My name is Anushree, and I'll be talking about sluicing in this presentation. More specifically, I will attempt to present a novel comparative analysis of the sluicing construction in two Indo Aryan languages, Bangla and Hindi. So, a quick roadmap of the talk. I'll begin with the introduction, after which I discuss the necessary background information on sluicing literature. I'll talk about the construction in both languages, along with the discussion of the controversial status of the complementizer. Afterwards, I'll put forth my proposal, which will be followed by the conclusion and discussion. I'll wrap up the session and then we'll move on to answering questions about anything that you guys might have. So let's begin. Now, sluicing refers to a form of ellipsis where, except for the WH phrase, the sentential portion of a constituent question is elided. Now, this definition has been put forth by Jason Merchant, who is the leading authority on ellipsis and sluicing. The widespread syntactic phenomenon, it's been documented cross-linguistically, and what you can see on screen is an example in English. So example one, Bill bought something, but I don't know what. So, the most parsimonious analysis of such a construction is one that has been advanced by both Ross and Merchant. They derive the sluice from WH movement followed by TP deletion, TP or IP deletion. So, here's a small schema of the same. Moving on, let us look at WH in C2 languages. So, however fitting that analysis was for languages like English, it doesn't sit well for languages which have WH in C2 mechanisms. So, like Hindi and Bangla, all of those languages pose an obvious challenge to this analysis since they supposedly lack WH movement but still manage to attest constructions that look like sluicing. So let's take a look at the next two examples. Number two is an example of Hindi sluicing. मैंने वहां किसी को देखा पर मुझे नहीं पता किसको. I saw someone there but I don't know who. And three is a sluice in Bangla. Someone has become angry, but I don't know who. Now, I would much rather read out the English translation because I am not a native speaker of Bangla and I wouldn't want to offend anyone with my pronunciation. So, here are two examples of the sluicing constructions in languages which are thought to be WH in situ and shouldn't ideally be reflecting such a construction in the first place. So, let us see what this is all about. Coming first to Hindi, let us talk about its characterization as a WHNC2 language, which is controversial at best, according to Mahajan. The in situ label doesn't quite fit, as the language permits multiple interrogative strategies, including WH in situ, like the first example presented on screen. Meena ne kamra kisko diya? Uh, there is also fronting of the WH word, like in the second example. Kisko Meena ne kamra diya? Now, oh, wait. The third interrogative strategy would be scope marking, which I seem to have forgotten to put on screen. Apologies for that, but let's move on since of the three and the one that I'm concerned with is the most natural question formation strategy, which consists of the placement of the WH phrase in the pre-verbal position. Now, as you can see, a construction where the WH phrase gets fronted to the clause initial position, it's also permissible and in some cases even more acceptable. Now, focus is assumed to be pre-verbal in Hindi, that is established. I I take it a step further and also assume that there are two focus positions in the language. One is IP internal and the other external. Now, moving on. Uh, as for the fronting example, we know that the WH fronts, but we don't know exactly where it moves to. So, one obvious suggestion is to a clause initial composition, which is the highest functional projection present in a clause. However, that cannot be the case if we refer to Richard's 2001 classification of Hindi Urdu as an IP absorption language. Now, IP absorption languages, according to this author, are languages where movement, both scrambling and WH, they take place to IP projections rather than to specifiers of CP, as in CP absorption languages. Pritha Chandra, she has proven that such is indeed the case by putting forth instances of WH islands, superiority effects, and interactions between WH dependencies, all of which are thought to be classic properties of IP absorption languages. So let me not go there. Now here enters another issue, which I call the complementizer conundrum. Now, the presence of the complementizer in embedded WH questions forms a key argument against the claim that the WH moves to spec of CP. Now, if it is, of course, intuitive, if the language permits constructions where the WH operator follows the complementizer, then it becomes obvious that the WH does not reside in the spec of CP because that place is already occupied. Let us take the examples here for a second. In both 4A and B, the complementizer precedes the WH operative. So it's Anu जानना चाहती है कि क्या तुम चाय पियोगे एंड रवि सोचता है कि कौन तुम सोचती हो कि आएगा. This is not the case in 4C. रवि सोचता है कि कौन रवि सोचता है कौन की तुम सोचती हो कि आएगा, which is ungrammatical as the complementizer follows the WH operative. So, my suggestion here is that the position that the WH phrase targets is lower than the complementizer, which heads C, namely spec of the focus phrase. Now, there is enough empirical evidence from numerous languages to show that such a position exists. The Q position, which is lower than the embedding complementizer. Hungarian is a language which attests movement of WH phrases to a low CP projection, below the complementizer again. So do Japanese and Burmese. So this analysis would be quite straightforward if the status of the complementizer, that is key, was undisputed. That is most definitely not the case. Now, this is mostly because the alleged complementizer has some rather peculiar properties to its name. It's a multifunctional element. It's used for question, non-question, quotative, non-quotatives, and even for subjunctives. It has an invariable form and is devoid of any selectional restrictions. So, as you can see, there is no consensus on the issue in the previous literature. However, I choose to go with Vinita Dayal's version of events. She literally saves the day here and presents a wonderful description of the complementizer. For a more detailed version, please check out her 1996 dissertation. I can either send it to you or for lack of time, I will not repeat her arguments here, but would certainly incorporate them in my paper. So feel free to take a look at that, or we can take it offline. Now, coming back to sluicing, sorry, that was a while round there. As per Jason Merchant, a cross-linguistic property of sluicing prohibits the occurrence of any phonological material in the comp domain, with the exception of the remnant itself. This property has been generalized as the first point that you see on screen now. However, surprisingly, Merchant puts forth his own counterexample from Hungarian, which allows the complementizer to accompany the remnant. Guess which language follows a similar pattern? It's Hindi. So, as you can see from example number 6, the overt presence of the complementizer suggests that movement of the remnant takes place to a site which is lower than that of the embedding complementizer, key as in the case of Hindi. A movement that is reminiscent of the kind of movement that's there in Hungarian. So, such constructions can also be found in Farsi and some Russian languages. I intend to embark on a similar line of analysis for Hindi Urdu sluices. Now, let's come to Bangla. Following up on the sluicing com generalization in Hindi Urdu that I was given in the previous section, I will try to gauge its effect on fellow Indo Aryan Bangla. However, as is observable from example number 8, the occurrence of the complementizer is prohibited in the language when occurring within a sluice. Now, as speculated by Bhattacharya and Simpson, the observation that complementizers are ungrammatical indicate a slightly different movement than in Hindi. The absence of the complementizer in Bangla can either be attributed to a doubly filled com type violation or due to an obvious unacceptability of the interrogative, that is the WH remnant, and the declarative feature uh, arising out of the complementizer occurring together on C. That is provided that the WH phrase occurs with the complementizer in the C head. Now, the kind of movement that I posit here, it can be likened to a topic-like interpretation of the sluice, which allows the remnant to move to an even higher topic position, preceding even the subject of the embedded clause. So let's take a look at example 9, where the sluice has been raised to the topic position, which is higher than the embedded subject V. In Hindi too, topicalization of sluiced phrases, which are mostly marked in nature, it leads to the deletion of the complementizer. Look at example 10. मोहिनी ने किसी को बुलाया था, पर किसको ये मुझे नहीं पता. Now, what is observed from this section and from relevant literature is that when a WH phrase is topicalized in Hindi, the entire clause raises to a higher position, leading to the deletion of key. This movement is similar to the kind observed in unmarked cases of Bangla, and as can be concluded from these observations, the contrast between the two languages is simply a matter of difference in the height of the landing site. My study speculates that the WH remnant moves to the spec of focus phrase in Hindi, but to the spec of complementizer phrase in Bangla. So here is my proposal. First, let's take a look at Hindi, followed by Bangla. So it's been well established that remnants of sluicing in English, they move to the spec CP position. For focus fronting languages like Hungarian and Farsi, and like how I claim Hindi, the remnants move to the spec of focus phrase. Example 11 has been put on screen to show us the derivation of the sluice in Hindi Urdu. Here is the derivative tree of the same. So, since sluiced phrases are assumed to be invariably focus marked, therefore, the first step would require the interrogative phrase to undergo focus fronting to the spec of the focus phrase. Following this movement, the complement of F, that is the TP, will be elided at PF. This derivation you can see on the screen. Kya is first raised to the spec of FP, following which the complement of its head, that is the TP, gets elided. Also, so does the rest of the sentence. Now, the primary argument for such an analysis stems from the presence of the complementizer. And the proposal presented in this section, it manages to explain straightforwardly why the sluiced remnant follows the complementizer in Hindi sluices. So, consequently, such an analysis also makes a key prediction about the focus phrase. If the E feature, that is the ellipsis feature, resides in the focus head, then movement of non-WH words through the spec of focus phrase should also be able to license IP ellipsis. So Hindi Urdu is then expected to attest both WH and non-WH sluicing. As can be seen from example 12, such a prediction is borne out. So what I mean to say is that the head that carries the ellipsis feature differs cross-linguistically. It is generated on the T head in English, the F head in Farsi, Hungarian, Malagasy, Russian, Polish, and also in Hindi. So what I also want to say is that this feature also differs in terms of its strength. It enables movement in some languages, and for others can be simply checked by agree. Additionally, I claim that the E feature for Hindi is a strong feature which requires the WH phrase to move to the spec position next to it to enable this checking process. Such a requirement would drive this obligatory focus fronting under sluicing. Moving on to Bangla now, as mentioned previously, the derivation of the sluice is similar to that in English. The WH remnant is raised to spec of CP, a higher landing site than the spec of focus phrase. Now, please observe the figure next to the example sentence, that is 14. The WH remnant kake raises to the spec of CP, after which the complements of his head, which is the rest of our sentence, gets elided. The E feature here resides in the C head as it does in English sluices. So here I am with the final conclusion. I'll just synthesize what I've explained up until now. Um, Looking at the sluicing construction, it's interesting to see how sluicing is not to be seen as a unified syntactic phenomenon. Different languages might use different syntactic means to arrive at the same surface form. This thought has been echoed by numerous scholars, in fact, and all of them have arrived at the same conclusion that sluicing doesn't refer to a single syntactic structure, but to a correlation between certain ellipsis configurations, the forms of which vary in a language. My paper builds upon a similar line of thought, entailing the possibility that the source of the sluice differs cross linguistically and even among members of the same language family. Through the interaction between the complementizer and the WH remnant, I showed that the interrogative phrase in Hindi undergoes focus fronting to the spec of the focus phrase, followed by an elision of TP. Additional evidence of the same comes from the fact that the language attests both WH and non WH sluicing. The absence of complementizer, however, in Bangla forces us to opt for a derivation where the interrogative phrase moves to spec of CP rather than spec of the focus phrase, which leads to the elision of its complement. Now, a direct consequence of this analysis is that it allows us to observe a finer picture of sluicing and non sluicing in both languages. Yeah, so this is it. Hopefully, I've done a good enough job to explain to everyone what was going on in my head. Yeah, this is it. Thank you so much.